I sort of had one of those weeks this week, you know the kind I'm talking about, and it reminded me of several things. First was this story about the young man who was preaching for the first time, and he stood before people, and as the moments passed, he eventually said, on my way here this morning, only God and I knew what I was going to share with you. And now, only God knows. This has been one of those weeks where I had this wonderful text, and I did too much reading, I think. I had too many ideas floating around. You get all this information coming at you about this wonderful story, and I haven't kind of known what to do with all of it, but I'm also reminded that there's this great thing for academics that says if you get your information from many people, that's called research. If you get your information from one person, that's called plagiarism. And so this is how my mind works. That then put me in mind of a poem I remembered from Gerard Manley Hopkins, which is good for this season, and it was an epitaph that he wrote for someone on one who borrowed his sermons. Her clothes preaching I'll no longer hear. They're out of date. Lent sermons all the year. Thank you, Alistair. Yes, I love that little poem too. So I've got all these things going around in my head. I'll try and make this come out okay somehow. So to start with, imagine we're in the temple that day. And imagine the smells, the sights, the sounds as we're in the temple. Someone suggested, and I'm quoting, the courtyard of the temple smelled like a barnyard. Underneath the bleating of sheep and cattle noises, you could hear the doves cooing in their cages. At low tables sat the money changers. The clink of heavy coins was constant, and irritated, impatient voices were raised in arguments over the rates of exchange. The temple courtyard was full of intense, busy people trying to get the best deal on an animal for this year's Passover offering. Even the most righteous Jews would have had trouble praying in this place. This story, Jesus cleansing the temple, is found in all four Gospels, but it has a unique position in the Gospel of John. Most of us remember the story as told by Matthew, Mark and Luke, and it occurs at the end of their Gospel story in the last week as Jesus enters what we call the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And so in Matthew it's in chapter 21, in Mark it's chapter 11, Luke chapter 19, towards the end of the Gospel. But in John, this story is in chapter 2, right at the beginning. Now, you're going to see that straight away you get a different interpretation. If you tell this story when people are shouting Hosanna, and you can see how immediately in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke, that story could lead to Jesus' arrest. He's done something shocking. But John puts this story, cleansing the temple, challenging the religious authorities, right at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. He throws out the money changers, drives out the animals, and he says, don't make my Father's house a marketplace. Remember the other story in chapter 2 of John's Gospel. The miracle of the turning water into wine at Cana. And we talked about that recently. Sometimes we struggle to understand the meaning of Jesus' first miracle in John's Gospel, or first sign. Some would prefer that Jesus didn't make wine. Some of you wouldn't, I know that. But some of us would prefer that I'll go with. John adds a particular detail that we might miss in our fascination with all that wine. The stone jars that were there, that Jesus used that were holding the water, were there for a purpose. Their purpose was to be the water that was used for purification as you came for rituals at the temple or in the synagogues, whatever. Jesus overturns a system with purification at its centre. An elaborate system has been developed over the centuries which names some things pure and other things impure. Women were impure for 7 days after the birth of a son and 14 days after the birth of a daughter. Dead bodies were impure. People with blemishes caused by leprosy or other diseases were impure. You people who've had skin cancers off, you're impure. Not allowed in. Certain foods were unclean. The list was very, very long of what was impure and what was pure. Changing water into wine wasn't primarily a way to enhance a slow-moving wedding party. It was an act of transformation, a breaking down of boundaries, a different way of seeing the world and God's place in it. It's not accidental then in John's Gospel that the next action takes place in the temple. For the temple had become the centre of a purity system. The animals being sold in the courtyard are for sacrificial purposes. The cattle, sheep, doves, they're the proper animals for sacrifice, sold according to one's ability to pay. But there were economic implications for purity. Poor people could hardly afford to give a tenth of their crop, and if they were unable to sell their grain, they were judged impure. And when it came to temple services, the poor were unlikely to buy the best animals. Money changes became very important in this system. Roman coins were considered impure and couldn't be used to buy sacrifices. The money changers weren't simply giving exchange for a 20, you got change for a 20, mate. They were giving pure tokens in exchange for impure money, sometimes for an extra fee. And here's an interesting bit that I read, which I had to slip in somewhere. The Jewish historian Josephus describes this scene and says that there was an ongoing feud between the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council, and the Jewish high priest Caiaphas, and it had happened around this time. Apparently, Caiaphas was peeved that the Sanhedrin had forced them from their office space in the temple area, and in retaliation, the Sanhedrin invited merchants to sell their animals near them outside the temple area. Not to be out-retaliated, Caiaphas had allowed merchants to sell their animals and exchange money right inside the temple precinct. So amid the barnyard smells and dirty animals and so on, within the sound of the clinking, clanking coins, secular money being exchanged for the kosher coinage of the temple, Jesus entered in on this Passover time. Now, I like that little bit of detail because I know a bit about church politics. And I can just imagine that playing out. That the church council has made a decision about something that the high priest thinks is not a good decision, and the high priest works out a way to get around it, and there's a bit of tit for tat going on. I know you're thinking it could only happen in the New Testament. No, church politics is fascinating for the observers of such things. So I can just imagine that that's exactly what was going on. There was a dispute about where was the right place for the animals to be sold. And it's not just incidental, it's because there's a spat going on. Something's about to happen, however. They'll turn this normal and unremarkable spring day into a Passover nightmare. As an observant Jew, Jesus goes to the temple among the thousands of other pilgrims. No doubt he wants to take in the sights and sounds, reconnect with his heritage, to converse with other pilgrims, maybe even to teach a little. But without apparent provocation, Jesus suddenly whips the whole temple area into a frenzy. He rigs a makeshift whip, and then he runs waving and swinging his whip like a madman at the animals and merchants along the walls. And when he reaches the table of the money changers, he vice grips the tables and hurls them topsy-turvy. "Get your things out of here," he yells. "Stop turning my father's house into a shopping mall." You can imagine the impact of his violent actions. Thousands of pilgrims instantly freeze in shocked disbelief. For an entire minute, nobody moves. Nobody says a word. In the distance, the animals bleat and run around happily with their newfound freedom. But in the temple area, people are dumbstruck. Have you ever been in one of those awkward situations when someone blunders or acts in such a party-destroying way that we all just stand where we are in silence, shocked, almost relieved when someone starts to talk again? No one will forget this day in the temple. Now, another thing that my brain went off on a tangent about was, can I even preach about this text in this church, in this week? We've been spending half the week having a mega sale. And in there, and there was a couple of times when I thought, I'm going to go in and turn those tables over and see how it feels. But then I looked and I thought, I don't need to, because the shoppers who come in manage to turn the tables over about every 5 minutes. And the volunteers have to spend their time unturning the tables and tidying them up again. Or I thought, what about a week when we've actually got a bird in the building? It's not for sale, I don't think. We've got to catch the thing yet, but yeah. So we're in a temple, we're in a place where there's an animal. Hold that thought. But then the biggie, don't we actually survive as a church to a large degree in this synod and in this place? And you know where I'm going with this one? As the smell of freshly roasted chicken wafts into our worship space, because we have the good sense and the good fortune to develop a site that can help pay the bills. Haven't we got our own marketplace? Perhaps I'll go into Woolies and do some table turning there. Well, again, my brain was going haywire this week. But you have to understand, in this temple area, it started out as a normal day for all of the people there. Passover is a busy time of the year, just like Christmas is for us. People came to Jerusalem from all over. They came to the temple to offer sacrifices and pay monetary offerings throughout the year, but during Passover, everyone came at the same time. Just imagine what it would be like today if you needed to go up to Jerusalem to offer up a little lamb as a sacrifice. In our context, COVID notwithstanding, we'd need to fly to get there. And first you'd have to go to Pet Barn, up on Daggett Road or wherever, and buy yourself a pet carrier, because you'd have to go to a farmer and find a lamb that you could buy, unless you raise sheep yourself, I guess. And you might need to go to the vet to get a tranquilizer for your poor little thing. Flying can be stressful for little animals. You'd buy plane tickets. You'd have every member of your family, and you'd pay a fee for the lamb to come along. You'd have to be sure that your travel agent got you a hotel room that allowed animals. Wouldn't it be easier to buy your lamb when you got there? Well, obviously it would. And that's how the system worked. Instead of everyone having to bring their ox or their lamb to the temple, they had stepped right up, all your sacrificial animals right where you need them, 2 for $1 or whatever. You got the point. They were right there and you could get them. Didn't have to bring your own. And even the half shekel temple tax that every adult man must pay required assistance from the money changers. If you've ever crossed the border from one country to another, you've seen a money changer. At the temple, you needed shekels. But why couldn't the priests have taken the other coins and changed them later? Well, there's a little more than this to this currency exchange. Because the Greek and Roman coins had pictures of gods on them. Even Caesar was believed to be a god. You couldn't take a coin with an image of an idol into the temple. You had to exchange it for a more appropriate coin. And of course, you had to pay a fee for the privilege. That's what money changers did. As far as we know, this was an ordinary day at the temple. It's true that the selling of animals and exchange of coins exploited the people, but this was nothing new. It was business as usual. I'm trying to stress what a normal and unremarkable day it all was. So what was Jesus all upset about? Why did he get so angry? Isn't it just the same old, same old? The merchants and money changers have been doing business at the temple for years. Everyone knew how the system worked. There's no indication that anyone was complaining. People knew that's just how things were. It's always annoying when you know you're being taken advantage of, but we've all learned to tolerate a certain amount of exploitation. We buy Christmas presents and give them on Christmas Day, even though we know the sales start the day after. We can all save a fortune if we go the next day. We tolerate a degree of exploitation. We buy our Easter eggs, and even though we know if we just bought a block of chocolate, we get 4 times the amount of chocolate, and one of those eggs that cost us an arm and a leg, we still do it. Dress up kids for Halloween. Buy firecrackers when it's firecracker night. We know that we're getting exploited. We know that we're lining the pockets of the manufacturers and the store owners. And nowadays, of course, you can pay with a plastic card. Hang on a minute. When you use your plastic card, you have to pay for the privilege of using it. They put on a bit of a surplus or a surcharge. Will you be paying with an Amex card, sir? That'll be interesting. And the Visa card, yes, this is how much extra you have to pay. What's the big deal? We're used to this stuff. Why did Jesus get so mad? Not a rhetorical question. Why did Jesus get so mad? Come on. Why did Jesus get so mad? Okay, I'll give you my version. I've got 3 things at least. There's that verse about zeal for my house will consume me, 1. Wanting proper worship in a proper place, and knowing that the temple was meant to be a place of prayer. The temple in Jerusalem no longer exists, of course. When the Spirit came to dwell, we're told that we've become temples. In our own body, in our own space, our own personal temples are to be houses of prayer, built by God, so that we might serve and worship our Creator. But we kind of forget that sometimes. We think destructive thoughts and we do destructive things. We've lost touch with God's original purpose for our lives. And just when we get comfortable, just when everything seems normal, when we've made peace with the way things are, Jesus comes in and shakes things up. He drives out the evil that's taken up residence in our hearts. He reminds us that God has better things for us than that. In spite of the feeling of disruption that we have, when God gets hold of us and turns over our tables, we would be wise to accept God's disruption as an occasion for dialogue. In other words, when God messes with your life, don't buck the system and don't just go with the flow. it would be a really good time to start talking with God about what's happening. Perhaps Jesus doesn't need to overturn the tables of your life when it comes to worship. But maybe he does. Maybe for some of us, worship is nothing more than a habit. If you're sitting there at the moment making a mental grocery list of the things you need to get at Woolies after the sermon, after the service, and I know I'll see most of you over there at Woolies after the service, if you're planning what you've got on for this afternoon as we sing the next hymn, maybe it is time to rethink why we're here on Sunday. But perhaps worship isn't your issue. Maybe there's other things that crowd out your mind. Family, work, health. Whatever it is, you better get ready. Because I think you're going to be disrupted by Jesus. I found this last story, I've got to use it. I don't know how it connects to anything else, but a father wanted to read the paper, but was being bothered by his little daughter, Vanessa. He tore a sheet out of his magazine on which was printed a map of the world. Tearing it into small pieces, he gave it to Vanessa and said, "Go into the other room and see if you can put this together." After a few minutes, Vanessa returned and handed him the map correctly fitted together. Father was surprised and asked how had she finished it so quickly. "Oh," she said, "on the other side of the paper was a picture of Jesus. When I got Jesus in his place, the world came out all right." I hope that Jesus disrupts your life at this time of worship. Because if we get Jesus right and in his place, then the world might just